Hey everybody, welcome back. This week we're going to be looking at transatlantic slavery, sugar power, and creolization, and we'll talk about that twice. We'll kind of do it for the whole week. There's a lot of stuff going on, so we won't cover everything this time. We'll cover about the first half of the chapter and look at some of those connections and sort of a really broad description of how the slave trade originates and where it sort of starts, how it gets going, and what the purpose of it is, and some of the early transformations that develop out of it. And then next time we'll look at more of those transformations and then movements to end the slave trade and the sort of results of that, or how it leaves the New World and West Africa totally different than how it found it. So between 1550 and 1700 is about the time period we'll be talking about today. We'll look at this European-led transatlantic slavery. I'll use that word several times, transatlantic. Basically, it just means the type of slavery that goes from West Africa to the Caribbean and South America and later the United States. It's a very particular type. It's different from what was going on in Europe or Africa before, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And it's going to really transform the economic situation, political situation, the way society works on both sides of the Atlantic. So it really is a sort of transnational or sort of global process, and we'll get into some of how that works. So specifically, this time we're going to talk about African states and empires. It's good to know what was going on in Africa before and sort of during the transatlantic slave trade. Often this gets left out of the story. People see the African side as like, oh, well, that's where stuff comes from, but then who cares? Who knows what's going on there? So we'll look at that. Then we'll look at the origins and the development of transatlantic slavery, how the slave trade became a thing, and what that looks like. It's sort of counterintuitive and doesn't work in a really linear fashion the way you might think. Then we'll look at sort of some of the demographic changes and economic changes, societal changes on both sides of the Atlantic, so in Africa and the Americas as well. We won't look at Europe too much. We talked about the transformations in Europe last time. So starting out, West Africa and the sub-Saharan kingdoms are all going to participate in the sort of development of the modern world. Often when people think of Africa in history, they think of it as like some prehistoric place that wasn't part of the process. Nothing could be further from the truth. During this time, Africa is changing and transforming just like Europe and Asia. A brief word on geography, just because this comes up a lot. No, Africa is not a country, as I'm sure most of you know. And today there's currently about 54 countries in Africa. It goes up or down a little bit every once in a while. But if you look at this graphic over here, you can see the size of the continent with other sort of well-known geological or geographic bodies laid in there. It's like the United States, China, India, most of Europe, right, Japan, could all fit within Africa. So the continent is absolutely huge. It has every type of weather, you know, around the Mediterranean. It's very Mediterranean. It's like Italy or Greece. South Africa is a very European type climate, actually. It's very moderate. It's one of the reasons Europeans choose to live there. You have big deserts, you have big jungles, you have huge rivers, right? Some of the biggest rivers in the world, the Nile and the Congo, all kinds of stuff going on. Basically any kind of climate you want, you can find in the continent. It also is not all by itself. Often you've heard me say like Afroeurasia. These places are all connected, and continents themselves are kind of funny myth in a way. So as you might know, you could walk from Africa into Asia or from Africa up into Europe. So they're not really separate entities, and they haven't been historically either. Most of the Roman Empire, for example, right, was in Africa. So these are really well-connected places. Europe and Asia are well connected to Africa and have been for a very long time. They have lots of historical connections. So there should be tons of stuff to talk about, right? So why is it always kind of left out? So I'm just going to give you a little clip of the sort of major African states that were there around 1500 to maybe like 1650. And that way you'll have a sense of where these enslaved peoples are coming from and what was happening in Africa that even set that up to be a possibility. So the first massive empire during this time was the Songhai Empire. We talked about it before a little bit. It's building on top of where Ghana and Mali used to be. And it's in that same sort of genre. It's lots of the trade is based on gold and salt. These are horse riding folks that are known for their like really powerful cavalries. The capital is at Gao. Hold on one second, let me get you a pen. Right around here. It's close to Timbuktu. If you thought that was just some made-up name or something in Bugs Bunny cartoons, it's not. Right, that was an old former capital. And it's a really strong empire. It's built on military strength and the ability to control the sort of salt for gold trade that's bringing trade sort of across the Sahara Desert. Under the Songhai Empire, there's lots of gold. On the north side of the Songhai Empire, there's lots of salt. There's a lot of trading back and forth. In fact, most of the gold that ends up, if you go to Europe and you see some amazing church and you're like, ooh, all these gold spires and stuff, a lot of that was through this trade coming out of Africa. Also, the Songhai Empire is fairly famous for having giant Islamic schools, intellectual movements, artistic movements. There you go. There's some of the trade routes to show you how sort of expansive the Songhai Empire was, how they're connected to the Mediterranean, how they're connected to sub-Saharan Africa, right? And here you go. It's a nice mosque. So you can see its own unique sort of art style, using these sort of timbers as structural pieces, but mostly using sort of a baked brick or baked clay, right, in the sort of architectural style. It's really funky and cool. You've probably seen some of these before, whether you knew there were mosque schools, libraries, stuff like that. But one specific thing the Songhai Empire never really did, when Europe and the sort of gunpowder empires, which we'll talk about later, like Iran and the Ottoman Empire, started to develop lots of gunpowder technology, guns, cannons, the Songhai Empire didn't. They had one of the strongest militaries in the world, and the leadership thought, look, man, we don't need this new funky stuff. We have this amazing cavalry. Nobody can beat us, so why would we need to adopt these new weapons? Well, it turns out maybe they should have. The empire actually doesn't last a really long time. Specifically, by 1591, the empire is going to start to fall apart because they get invaded by Morocco, which is another sort of an African kingdom that's northwest of them, like on the coast right across from Spain. And when the Moroccans invade, they have far fewer people. They're not as skilled warriors necessarily, but they got guns. So those guns are really powerful, particularly when fighting cavalry. Normally when you fight cavalry, if you just have a sword or something, it's really scary because there's a guy coming at you with a horse. That can really freak you out. But if you have a gun, you're not too worried about it, right? You can just shoot the guy long before they can get to you. So it really changes the dynamic, and we'll look at more of that later. When the Songhai Empire collapsed, it left West Africa really fragmented. So you can still see on this map, there's like a little remnant of the Songhai Empire here. But the whole rest of it has just fallen apart into all of these different constituent states. These were different ethnic groups, different sort of cultural entities, old kingdoms, different families, right? So you see like Mali there, right? So that's like a legacy from previous empire as well. So all of these different groups kind of had ancient beef. They didn't like each other from past times, or they were upset that they had been included in the Songhai Empire, or they had their own sort of like independent struggle to break away from the empire. So they have all of their own political and military interests, and they're not, in the future, everybody's going to be like, oh, Africa is kind of like one place and stuff from like an American perspective. But at this point, it's so many different groups that are all like on different wavelengths. They're not connected by anything in particular, right? They're their own entities. But whenever you have this sort of political fragmentation, bad things can happen. Further south, another massive kingdom that we're going to see is the Kingdom of Congo. You look at the dates on this is really pretty amazing, right? From about 1400 to about 1857. the Kingdom of Congo is existent. It's a huge kingdom. It's a swath of sort of central West Africa or sub-Saharan Africa along the Congo River. Even today, this area is a large sort of country, right, that's still kind of held together despite colonialism and other things like this. So pretty quickly after they were founded, they start to have relationships with the Portuguese. So within about 100 years of the founding of the kingdom, the Portuguese are there. They're trading. We're going to see later they're looking for gold and sugar and slaves and stuff eventually. And the sort of relationship is pretty fraught. One of the things the Portuguese bring with them is Christianity. And as it turns out, there's a king, Zinga Mbemba, who is going to be looking for something different to help him sort of collect his political power. He is going to appreciate that the Portuguese gain power from their through Christianity, through sort of proclaiming their connection to God. They're able to claim a sort of legitimacy and a sort of power, and he wants in. He changes his name to Alfonso I, a nice Portuguese name, and he converts to Christianity, and he says everybody in the kingdom is now a Christian. And he works to sort of Christianize the kingdom, claiming that this will help them become more modern, this will help them develop, this will help the kingdom thrive. It's really useful for the Portuguese because if now you have the king is Christian and he's Christianizing people, well, who are the experts on Christianity? It's the Portuguese, right? So they have priests, they have traders that are Christian that can really tap into that. But there's also going to be some conflicts with the Portuguese coming. The Portuguese want to do things like build a giant fort at the mouth of the Congo River. The Portuguese are going to want slaves. It doesn't necessarily align with the interests of the people of Congo or with the king. So we'll see that that's going to come into conflict, even though the Portuguese are going to have a pretty solid foothold there. Another kingdom just south from Congo, you can see here, is the kingdom of Ndongo. It's going to be called Angola in the future. It's a Portuguese colony in the future, but originally it's its own kingdom. It's a vassal state of Congo. So it's the kingdom of Congo had like a lot of power there, and Ndongo wasn't like its own state entirely, but it wanted to be. So there was a lot of sort of conflict between Congo and Ndongo, almost like a civil war, you can think of it. So when the Portuguese show up, a lot of the people in Ndongo want stuff from the Portuguese to help them win this war, whether that's political power, whether that's guns, whether that's money. A lot of people in Ndongo are interested in making connections with the Portuguese to help them sort of be separate or to fight the Congolese. But it doesn't work out really well. Pretty quickly, the Portuguese are going to come to want slaves out of this area, and the people in Ndongo aren't really excited about that. In particular, one person, Queen Nzinga, here she is, hold on a second. There you go. Okay. So Queen Nzinga is a really, really interesting person. She had fought in these early resistance wars against the Portuguese and the Congolese, trying to sort of keep them from having too much influence in the country. Yeah, they wanted Portuguese money and weapons and stuff, but they didn't want the Portuguese running the show. They didn't want to become a Portuguese colony. So in particular, she wanted to sort of abolish the slave trade. She saw what the Portuguese were doing to Central Africa, and she kind of had a sense of what was coming and wanted a sovereign empire instead. She sort of envisioned that there would be almost like a republic or something. It's a little too early to talk that way, as we'll find out that's not coming for a little bit. But she envisioned like these African folks getting together and forming some sort of broader union that would not rely on Europe for money or weapons, and that would include the Congolese, their neighbors. So she fought against the Portuguese for a long time, for like 30 years, She very famously dressed as a man. She smoked a pipe. She went into war. She had a harem of uh, husbands that she made dress as women and follow her around and like act on her behalf and stuff. Very famous, lots of really funky stories. I think now we'd probably call her transgender or something, but at the time wasn't really a term, or people weren't thinking like this. And there are lots of stories about her interactions with the Portuguese that just blew people away. For example, there was supposed to be a peace negotiation, and the Portuguese had like a nice table and chairs on their side, and they had just laid out like a rug for the Ndongo people to like sit on or something. So they all walked into the room. The Portuguese sat in their nice chairs, and they kind of like mockingly looked at her like, "Oh, what are you gonna do? Just like sit on the floor?" Nah, she, snapped her fingers. One of the dudes came over and sat down kind of like a chair, and she sat on his back and was like, "Okay, let's start the negotiation," so she could be on level with them. So really, really interesting sort of resistance right against the Portuguese incursions early on. By 1657, there is a peace deal. She agrees to sign a peace with the Portuguese and the Congolese that Ndongo will be its own country and will be able to have some control over the slave trade and stuff like this. But that doesn't last very long, and pretty quickly, within 15 or 20 years, it's going to become a formal colony of the Portuguese called Angola. As soon as the Queen is out of power, no longer leading military raids and stuff like this, it sort of falls apart pretty quickly. Still a really interesting example of sort of early resistance, right, to these sorts of things. On the east coast of Africa, particularly sort of as you get kind of to the south out of the Red Sea area, people often refer to this as the Swahili coast, partially because that's the language that's spoken there. Swahili is a really interesting language. It's a mix of Arabic and other East African languages, kind of used originally as a pidgin for trading and stuff like this, that over time became its own language. You can see there's some cities highlighted like Zanzibar and Mombasa that are these giant trading ports. And these were connections between these East African civilizations and the Indian Ocean trade, right? So they're going to Madagascar, they're going to India, they're going to Southeast Asia. It's all sort of connected, this trade for sugar and spices and other commodities. But during the 1500s, a lot of stuff's going to change in this area. It's one of the sort of centers of the African Indian Ocean trade. And so when the Portuguese and the Spanish and others start arriving, they try to cut in on this trade. This region's super diverse. It's really multicultural, multi-ethnic. There's people from Southeast Asia, from India that live there. People in Madagascar, for example, genetically are closer to Southeast Asians than they are to other Africans, depending on who you test, right? So there's a lot of connections. But the Portuguese don't particularly care for that. They want just one sort of ethnic supremacy. They want to be in charge of the Indian Ocean trade if they can. So they build big forts like these along the coast and try to control the trade. It doesn't really work out for them. They don't really monopolize East Asia, but they do disrupt a lot of local exchange currents and sort of mess up the functioning trading system that was there. And a lot of these East African city-states are going to kind of go into decline just because they get thrown off balance by these Portuguese trying to take control, even though the Portuguese themselves never actually get control. Sort of more broadly speaking, across the continent, you might look at religious diversity because this is going to show up later in the transatlantic slave trade. We'll find out that a lot of enslaved folks, for example, were Muslim or were Christian already before they get to the Caribbean or the Americas, which is really interesting. That's often kind of left out of the story. So across Africa, you have these sort of syncretic religions forming, particularly around Christianity and Islam. Today, most people in West Africa and North Africa are Muslim, and this is in large part due to Fulani peoples proselytizing and sort of spreading around the Saharan region. But also, a lot of people argue that West Africans and Central Africans had a sort of earlier religious tradition that made Islam and Christianity more appealing, in that they believed that there was a sort of really distant creator that you couldn't really know anything about, that sort of made the universe or the world, but just like really far away. And then you had local spirits that were tied to your family, tied to a place, tied to geographic markers, tied to geological boundaries and mountains, rivers, things like that. So when Christianity and Islam start to move across Africa more and more, it's sort of easy in some ways to transition and be like, oh yeah, that distant creator, we call that God, right? It's a sort of easy step in between. And the Fulani people are Muslim and are going to become a really prominent ethnic group during this time around the end of the Songhai Empire, and continue to be a sort of prominent ethnic group in North and West Africa today. Lots and lots of people, as I said already, in the Congo are going to convert to Christianity, in large part because the king, Alfonso, right, is just like, let there be Christianity. So we'll see that does have an impact coming down the line for sure. So, okay, you know a little bit more now about what was happening in Africa in the 1500s, 1600s. So how does transatlantic slavery develop, and what happens? It's really funky because I think for a lot of people it's kind of overwhelming when you actually start to look at what was happening. So people are just like, oh, it's this horrible, nasty thing that happened in the past sometime, and then we became modern and we got rid of it. But that's not really true. Transatlantic slavery, in fact, was very much a part of the modern process. It didn't exist before. It's only during the modern era that it develops, and it actually increases in speed as we get more modern, as we'll see. So there were lots of different institutions of social bondage around the world in sort of very early historical times. In the modern period, there's all kinds of different forms of this. So Africa had their own form of social bondage, and it was distinct from the forms of slavery or social bondage that we see in Europe or Asia, or in the Americas. It worked in a really different way because there was a different sort of economic system and ideas about how property worked. Primarily in West Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, for example, a lot of anthropologists will say there was no particular concept of private property. And that is in terms of the sort of European legal idea of private property that started to develop itself only in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s in Europe, based on new laws and stuff like that. So instead of thinking in terms of private property and economic success and like that Scrooge McDuck vision of like having piles of money you sit on, people in Africa, when they thought of being wealthy by and large, thought about wealth in people. What made you powerful or what made you wealthy was the amount of people you could control. And I don't necessarily mean through a sort of slavery process, but I mean the amount of people that you could mobilize to build something, or that you could mobilize to go to war, or that you could count on to defend your house, or that you could count as people who produced things for your family. So one way you became more wealthy was to have more control over people. Well, you could get control over people, and in a sort of slavery sense, people who owed your family money, people that you caught in combat, stuff like this. But it had a really different sense to it. First, often after a debt was paid, the person would be freed, or after a certain period of time, the person was no longer a slave. Also, if the person was enslaved, they became a part of your family. So my last name is Finley. I capture someone in battle, which probably wouldn't happen, but let's say it did. All of a sudden, there's a new member of the like Finley clan. So yeah, they're a slave. Yeah, they don't necessarily want to be there. They're bound to me socially, but they're also now a part of my family. So I have to take care of them, and they have to sort of participate in whatever my group is doing. Also, slavery was not hereditary. So I catch person B in a war. They work for me, but their kids are not my slaves. They're a part of my family, so their kids might or might not be a part of my family, depending on various relationships and who they have that kid with. But um, their kids are not indebted to me. Their kids were not caught in combat. Their kids aren't slaves. So a really different tradition than what's going to develop in the Americas. So the transatlantic slave trade is going to begin with the Portuguese, but not necessarily looking for slaves. So this area, what you're looking at is like the part of the Mediterranean that goes out to the ocean. Here, I'll draw it for you. So this is Portugal and Spain. This is North Africa here and Morocco here, right, and going down the coast. So the Portuguese kind of envisioned this part of Africa and this area, once you turned the coast and started going underneath, like into the Horn of Africa, as the Gold Coast. They knew there was a bunch of gold there, and the Portuguese really wanted that gold. And remember, we talked about they also wanted to like get on and maybe find spices and stuff like that and get around the Ottoman Empire. But from the 1450s on, they're going to start to do other things. They're going to start to move slaves around for other African groups, particularly the people in Benin. And we talked about them a little bit before. Remember, they're the people with the masks that had like Portuguese traders on them and stuff like that. They managed the Portuguese quite a bit better than the people in Congo. So from the 1450s on, these Portuguese traders are going to engage in what's called the carrying trade. They're going to basically take slaves from one group to another on the African coast in exchange for gold, right? It's the gold they're looking for. And gold's going to remain the primary commodity that the Portuguese and other European groups are going to trade on the West Coast for quite a long time, even up to maybe 1700. So at first, the Portuguese are looking for gold. Then something else kind of funky happens. Well, the Portuguese are using a lot of this gold to buy sugar. Sugar is kind of a new global commodity. People like it, obviously, because it's sweet. It's originally from maybe Southeast Asia or India, it's unclear, but it had made its way into the Red Sea, it had made its way to Europe, and it was part of the European diet. Well, as the Portuguese were exploring the coast of West Africa, they found that a lot of these islands off the coast weren't inhabited. Some were, but most weren't, and they were very sort of tropical, and they were just perfect for growing sugar. So some Portuguese started to think, hey, instead of doing all this work to get gold so we can buy sugar, what if, instead we just grow our own sugar? So some of these islands, the first one is Madeira, which is up here. You can't quite see it on this map. And then the second one is Sao Tome, down here is a really important one. These were big Portuguese settlements where they decided to try and grow their own sugar. So originally the Portuguese set up on these islands. They thought, okay, we can build some sugar plantations here, right, that Engenho system. But there just aren't that many Portuguese people, and there weren't that many people on the islands, if there were any, so they needed labor. These were going to be big plantations for growing sugar. So, okay, where do you get it? Well, the first thing they tried was just going into Africa and capturing slaves. So there was, remember, this existent slave trade. If you caught somebody in battle, okay, that's good. So the Portuguese try to go into different places in West Africa. They go upriver, they try to catch people, but it doesn't work. The Portuguese just get beat up. Remember, there's still empires there. There's people who know the local terrain. In the 1400s, the Portuguese don't have a huge technological advantage over other Africans. So most of the early Portuguese that go inland to Africa just immediately die. And you may have heard of Africa as the Dark Continent. And a lot of people think that's like a racial thing, and like later it is. But at first, when the Portuguese wrote about Africa and they start talking about the Dark Continent, it's because every time they go in there, they die. Not only do they die because there's a bunch of warriors that know what they're doing, that defend themselves, but there's also a lot of diseases that the Portuguese hadn't been exposed to yet. But remember, they will, and they're going to take those to the New World, like we talked about. So by the 1450s, the Portuguese are growing sugar in Madeira. 50 years later, they're growing sugar in Sao Tome, that island right off the coast there, in Central Africa, right outside of Congo. And within about 30 or 40 years, there's tons of sugar plantations on the island, maybe 60 sugar mills. And to do this, they need lots of slaves. So they're going to start selling this sugar. They're going to start using some of that gold they have to buy slaves from Congo, from Benin, from other places in West Africa to work on these plantations. Then they start to think, aha, remember the Pope split the world in half and gave us this huge chunk of land like Brazil? Maybe we should start doing the same thing there. Maybe we could take some of these African folks across the Atlantic, take them to Brazil, and set up these same type of sugar plantations there. So in the early 1500s, you're seeing maybe a couple thousand slaves a year across the Atlantic. So at first, it's a very slow process. Here you go. Here's a sort of Portuguese description of the slave labor, right? Remember I told you sugarcane is pretty tall. It's really labor intensive to grow and to process. So if you're going to start taking people across the Atlantic to work on big plantations in the Caribbean islands or in Brazil or the Americas in general, you have to get them. And where the Portuguese got them was through those early contacts, particularly in Congo. So the Congolese had a tradition of selling and exchanging slaves. Remember, if someone's in debt, they can become a slave, right? Or if they're captured in war. And so you could sell them if you'd rather have money or pay off your own debt. So the Congolese sold slaves to the Portuguese. But the Portuguese wanted more. They quickly exhausted the sort of local system of slavery. So the Portuguese started going to Ndongo, right, looking for slaves. The Portuguese also started to mess around a little bit. And they figured out that, okay, if two groups get into war, there'll be a lot of captives, there'll be a lot of slaves, we can buy them then. So the Portuguese are going to kind of try to play Congo and Ndongo off each other. They're going to look for other states that are having problems and are engaging in conflicts with their neighbors. And this allows them to really collect a lot of people. The Congolese pretty quickly pick up on what's going on, that the Portuguese are sort of stoking the fires of conflict so that there can be more captives, so that they can buy more people, and they try to put an end to it. So this is after Alfonso, this is a little bit later. So by 1665, the Portuguese are going to say, look, you know, you keep trying to stop us from engaging in slave trading here. We're just going to attack you. They take the king out in public, they chop his head off. Basically, after that, Congo is a Portuguese colony, even though it maintains itself as an independent kingdom. But really, it's being managed by the Portuguese, at least in terms of the Portuguese controlling this aspect of the nation's or the kingdom's trade. So I told you earlier, this is all sort of part of the modern process. So these engenho, right, these plantations that are built on a machine, like a water wheel or a wind wheel, like what you see here, right, for crushing sugarcane, they're a really lucrative crop. So the Portuguese are selling this sugar they're making off West Africa, but they're making way more sugar in the Caribbean or in Brazil. The Spanish are going to start doing the same thing. The British are going to do the same thing later with different crops. So the sugar plantations are incredibly good at making a commodity that can be sold in Europe. And you start to see other plantation style models being set up all over the Americas to produce raw materials that can be sent to Europe. And this is the beginning of what you might call the triangle trade, where essentially Europeans have a manufactured good, think clothes, guns, things like this. They sell these things in West Africa in exchange for slaves. The slaves are taken to the Americas, where they then produce raw materials on plantations. Those raw materials are then sent to Europe for food or to make the manufactured goods that are sent to Africa, right? And the process kind of goes around. This is as capitalistic as it gets. Labor, materials, industrialization, it's all here. So capitalism and industrialization are not somehow like a fix for slavery or somehow like what comes after slavery. Slavery is baked into the whole process. Without slavery, capitalism would not have developed the way that it did. Also, you see a bunch of like weird little problems in this loop that you have to fix. So if Europeans, for example, manufactured things that Africans didn't want, the system would fall apart. So you also have to manufacture the desire for them. So it's cool to have guns, but if you can't sell them in Africa, you're not going to get slaves. So the Portuguese feeding the conflicts, or the Spanish or the British or the French feeding the conflicts, not only allows them to get more slaves, it also allows them to sell more guns into West Africa. And when you sell more guns into West Africa, you have these groups that don't like each other. Now they have more guns. Now they can capture more people. Now they can sell more slaves to the Europeans. So you get a real strong sort of feedback loop occurring here. Speaking of taking these slaves across the Atlantic, if you haven't heard of this, this is often referred to as the Middle Passage. This is the portion after people have been captured or caught in West Africa or Central Africa. They're taken to some sort of coastal city or a port city where they are then sold to European traders who put them on ships and take them to the Caribbean or Brazil or the Americas more broadly. And that period for when they're on the boat leaving West Africa to when they get to the Caribbean or when they get to Brazil is referred to as the Middle Passage, right? When you're actually on the boat, on the water. Here's a really nice depiction of it. This is about as good as conditions as people could have hoped for on the Middle Passage. Conditions were actually horrible and much, much worse than this. Here's a nice sort of museum piece that recreates how people would have been stored. Because remember, if you are engaging in slave trading, you have to convince yourself that these people are commodities. If they're human beings, you're not going to be able to do it, right? It's not going to work. So you have to think of these people as freight, their cargo. So how do you fit the most cargo on a ship? How do you make sure they get to where they're going? It takes about 4 to 6 weeks to get across the Atlantic, depending on which ship you're on. Remember, these people wouldn't have known each other. So these are lots of different people from different ethnic groups, different tribal groups, different clans that have been captured in different locations and marched out to the ocean. They didn't really have much in common. Sometimes you would have people that knew each other on the same ship, but not always. And about 25% of these people that get put on ships are not going to make it across. So it's about 4 million people die in the Atlantic. Sometimes this happens because they're sick. If they're sick, often the slavers would throw them overboard because you can't have them infecting your other cargo. So think about it like you're moving a bunch of oranges and you find out some of the oranges have mold. You don't really want them up against the other oranges anymore. So once you decided in your mind that these people are not people, they're just some commodity, it allows you to do things like this. Other people jumped over the side willingly. They didn't necessarily know what was going on, but it was just too sort of horrible to deal with. It's an incredibly dark, evil sort of thing that was happening, and millions of people die along the way. Some historians have talked about if you could just drain out the Atlantic and dug down a little bit, you would just see giant trenches of bones, right, from these millions of people who had died that are left on the bottom of the ocean. It's a really incredible, sort of horrible thing. Here's a sort of map of this movement of where the people are coming from and where they're being taken to. A lot of Americans, when we go through sort of primary school education, middle school education, high school education, slavery is depicted as an American problem. And, or maybe, hopefully, sometimes it's just depicted as an American thing. But actually, if you look at this graph, on the right side, you can see where people are coming from in Africa, and then you can see where they're taken. And it's really apparent that actually way fewer people are brought to America at all than other places. So you have millions of people, 12 million people taken from the coasts of West Africa. Remember, 4 million are going to die in transit, and of those millions that get across, mostly they're going to go to the Caribbean and Brazil. So the American context is kind of a little bit later, it's a little bit different. This is why if you go to the Caribbean today, or if you go to Brazil today, you'll find lots and lots of people of African ancestry. In most places, the majority of people. Is this huge demographic shift. I mean, you're talking about millions and millions of people being moved. And again, in that theme of it's a modern process, it wasn't like this is all something that happened way ancient past and then it like trickled off. In fact, the opposite is true. So here is the number of slaves moved across the Atlantic per year. So you can see in the 16th century, it's like a couple of thousand of slaves per year. The 17th century, maybe 20,000 slaves per year. The 18th century, you're talking like almost 60,000 slaves a year are being transported across the Atlantic. So the numbers are increasing. As we're going to see even a little bit later, those numbers continue to increase locally in some places like the United States as slavery gets closer and closer to being abolished. So this isn't some like ancient African tradition. It's not some old world thing. It's part of this new transatlantic reality. Europeans are setting up plantations that are becoming more and more sort of industrial in character in the Americas. And in order to do that, you need more and more people. But this drive to pull more and more people out of West Africa and transport them halfway around the world has a series of effects on people in Africa and in the Americas that radically change what societies look like, who's participating in society, what economics look like on both sides of the Atlantic. Often, again, the effects on Africa are just totally ignored, as if somehow pulling 12 or 16 million people out of West Africa would not affect it. Nothing could be further from the truth. It radically changes people around the world. So we could look at sort of the demographics in Africa during this time and try to see how they're trading and what's changing because of these trades. So Europeans are going to be bringing in a lot of new material and technology to Africa, right? Part of that triangle trade is they have to be bringing stuff to West Africa and to Congo that the Africans want to buy in order for them to get slaves. So they're bringing in new technologies like guns and cannons, shipping technology, clothing technology. Eventually, they're going to be bringing in industrial technologies. But they also bring a bunch of stuff with them like food. So remember, the Columbian Exchange is sort of changing foods around the world. So things like manioc or cassava is going to become a staple crop in West Africa. Chilies are going to be introduced and stuff like that. So a lot of African food is going to change. Potatoes are going to be introduced. Corn is going to be introduced. So there's actually a lot more food, calorie-wise, in West Africa during this period, which accounts for the population actually going up, despite, 12 or 16 million people being pulled out of West Africa and Central Africa. So even though you're having just millions of people ripped out of the continent, populations are going up due to the Columbian Exchange, due to these new sort of foodways and the ability to get more and more calories out of the land around you. But remember these 16 million slaves that are taken from the coast, 4 million die, right? So 12 million are going to make it to the Americas. You have to account for that sort of change, that sort of loss. You can't just pull 16 million people, even over a couple hundred years, out of somewhere and expect it to be the same. So this has really uneven results. Many places in Africa were relatively unaffected by the slave trade. So you can look at parts of Central Africa like Rwanda, Burundi. You can look at the Maasai people. You are probably familiar with them. They're the most sort of photographed Natural Geographic type representation of Africa. They wear kind of red cloak, they jump, they're with cows often, right? That depiction. Turkana people, these people are all going to resist the slave trade. They don't get captured very much, and they don't get sold as slaves very much. They're just sort of too far from the port cities. It makes it not lucrative. It makes it sort of difficult. So there's big sections of Central Africa that just aren't affected in the same way. Other societies are going to actually benefit a lot economically. So here's a depiction of the Asante people. They're going to make lots and lots of money off of this slave trade. They're great warriors. They're able to capture a lot of people, their neighbors. And when they sell them to the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, whatever, they're going to make a lot of money off this. Dahomey people, Oyo people, same thing. These were people that were in conflicts with their neighbors and turned that into a sort of lucrative system. But they're the exceptions. The vast majority of people in West and Central Africa are really hurt by the trade, not only in having people removed, but having these sort of conflicts highlighted and reinforced over and over again to encourage more slave trading to occur. This has some unexpected consequences that make perfect sense once you start sort of thinking about it. So the slave trade was often looking for men because the primary purpose for most of these enslaved peoples was going to be labor on plantations. So people wanted to buy men because men would ostensibly be able to produce more labor and work harder and stuff like this. That's a little, off, but doesn't matter. So 2/3 of all of the enslaved people that were taken from Africa were men. This meant that in some communities, there were far fewer men than women. So by the late 1700s, for example, in Angola, right, which was Ndongo, 60 to 70% of people were women. Some communities it was even higher, maybe 80% women. So this led to a lot of changes. If 80% of your community is different, or is women, things are just going to have to work differently. So in a lot of African communities, you start to see polygamy occurring that wasn't a traditional feature of the community. But if you just have so many more women than men, those women still want to have families. They still want to have economic security. And so you would have men marrying multiple women because there was a sort of social need to do that. Also, women started to fill in for a lot of formerly male roles. So in some communities where most of the men were gone, women had to step up to be soldiers or protect the community because that couldn't be done otherwise, right? So in particular, one group, Dahomey women, were particularly famous for becoming soldiers and defending their community and also engaging in slave raids. And if these women look familiar to you, or if you're thinking, wait, there were whole communities of African women that operated as soldiers, yeah. If you saw Black Panther or whatever, they didn't just make this up, right? This is based on the Dahomey warriors. It's not like a bunch of garbage or anything. It's real in that many of these communities had been so sort of stripped, that the men had been stripped out of them so much that women had to engage in these sorts of roles. But what's interesting about that is then Europeans are going to look at this and they're going to be like, oh, gross. These Africans do all this horrible stuff. They engage in polygamy. They have women, doing men's jobs and stuff like this. But what's really weird about that is that only happened because Europeans were taking Black men out of Africa. And so it's strange because Europeans are going to come up with this idea that Africans are savage and they're ruled by women and they're all this sort of crap. But those situations only occur because of what Europeans are doing. And we'll see more stuff like that in the future. Gender roles are going to be uneven in the Americas too. It's sort of the reverse effect, right? So in Africa, you have more women left, but less men. In the Caribbean and other places in America, see as 2/3 of the enslaved folks were men, you're going to have much larger populations of men. So when you have a community where 70% of it is men, lots of things aren't going to work quite the same. You can't have every man marry a woman, right? Polygamy often doesn't work the same way around. People don't do it in most places. And also these were slaves, so their families were typically controlled by European powers anyway. So with 2/3 of the population being male, it was really hard for these groups to reproduce naturally. You could have whole communities of slaves that functioned as small towns and things like this, but without a closer gender balance, it's really, really hard for those communities to be self-supporting. So this led to the need for more and more slaves to be brought to the Caribbean. Plantation owners required a certain amount of labor, and they were looking to grow their business, so they always wanted more labor. The labor was really intensive. Lots of slaves had a very, very short life expectancy. The labor is really tough. Look at that. That cane there is like 3 times the size of those people, right? They have these huge knives. They're treated poorly. They get, the worst food, the worst shelter, the worst education. Of course, their lives are going to be relatively short and miserable. So plantation owners, though, didn't particularly care. They just thought, well, okay, just bring in more people whenever we need them. So this led to all kinds of problems that we'll see coming down the line in the future as well. Aside from just the sort of basic gender imbalances, this is all going to lead to a new sort of class and racial structure in the Americas that's really different from what you had in Europe or what you had in West Africa. So in the Americas, as we kind of talked about a little bit before with mestizo society and new sort of Spanish racial designations, with transatlantic slavery, this gets a whole another element. You have Spanish and Portuguese people, and you have all of their sort of racial tropes. You have a bunch of people coming in from West Africa that are unfree and that are coerced into all kinds of relationships and work relationships, sexual relationships. So you quickly have all kinds of different mixed folks who are Black and Spanish, Black and British, Black and Mestizo, Black and Mexican, right? All kinds of stuff like this. And people don't really know what to make of it, right? It's just, it didn't exist before in either a European or African context. It's a sort of a new world of racial hierarchies and attempts to sort of understand all this stuff and put it together in a meaningful way. Also, as one group of people is enslaved, actually that's not true, there's two. There's peoples from West and Sub-Saharan Africa, but there's also Native Americans who were enslaved. That leads to different class and sort of racial structures put together. Often class and race go hand in hand. So if you just look at these pictures, you see really funky stuff happening. In the top left picture, these look to be like mestizo women or maybe Creole women, but you also see slaves in the background. Some of them are like working, some of them are really well dressed. Maybe those are the ones that worked for those particular women. Other one might have worked on the plantation. If you look at the picture right above me, you see white women working. Those are probably indentured servants. But then you see Black folks working in the back, but those are not indentured servants. Those are probably slaves. Over here, you see what looks to be like the sort of British colonial image going to look at like slave families that work on the plantations, but then you see like another class of slave that maybe lives with the family. It becomes just a really weird tangle of different racial and class priorities. And we're going to see how that plays out. These different groups are going to feel like they have a different role within society. In some cases, that's going to lead towards a sort of revolutionary feeling, which we'll see more kind of next time. So this European-led transatlantic slavery really did transform the economy and population in Africa and the Americas for sure, and to an extent contributed to all those transformations in Europe that we saw last time. So when we look next time, we're going to see how the system sort of slowly develops over time and the sort of reactions to the system. Who's trying to keep it? Who's trying to get rid of it? How long is it going to stay? And what comes out of it? And we're going to try to expand a little bit more on these new sort of classes and races of people. And something happens that is often described as creolization. where you get new cultures, new languages, new religions that are mixes of European, African, and American stuff, all kind of fit together in new and interesting ways. And it has a really long-term legacy on the Americas. So we'll kind of look at that next time when we do the transatlantic slave trade, sugar power, creolization, and emancipation part 2. Keep reading that Traditions and Encounters, and as always, email me any questions. Talk to you soon.